Good morning, everybody. This is Steve Fletcher with a trumpet for my people. Today is July 24th, 2020, and I want to share this article I found on Drudge Report. Politico, 8 big reasons Election Day 2020 could be a disaster. Very interesting article, very interesting read. I just want to share this with you guys. You may think you know how bad November 3 will be, but all signs point to something far, far worse. In a campaign year marked by a global pandemic, a recession, and a national wave of protests, it's easy to forget that this whole election season began with an absolute debacle when it came to the simple act of voting. The mobile app used for the Democratic caucuses in Iowa collapsed so badly that the country was left unsure, forever as it turns out, who won. In March, malfunctioning voting technology in California led to hour-long delays. In April, the pandemic left Wisconsin voters unsure the night before whether the polls would even open. And by May, unable to guarantee the safety of physical voting, 16 states had delayed their primaries or switched to vote by mail options. Then came Georgia's primary in June, where massive confusion and long lines led to what observers called a meltdown. Some people waited in line to cast their ballots until 1 a.m. Every month of this year has brought new evidence that voting in 2020 hasn't been going very well. And with perhaps the most consequential election in generations, they say that every time, right? When the nation ratifies or rejects President Donald Trump's divisive agenda, experts are starting to believe that the general election will be much, much worse. And this is where it gets interesting. People often deploy the perfect storm metaphor incorrectly, using it to describe a surprise collision of events that catches its victims off guard. We have talked recently about the election being on the day of Noah's flood on the Hebrew calendar, and now they are connecting the election to the perfect storm, using it to describe a surprise collision of events that catches its victims off guard. Anxious Democrats are already fretting about nightmare scenarios in which Trump uses emergency powers to cancel the election, calls in the military to oversee voting, or even refuses to vacate the White House. But conversations with more than a dozen campaign strategists, security officials, and election administrators make clear that the most likely picture this fall is something less theatrical and every bit as destabilizing. November 3, even if it proceeds as scheduled, is likely to bring bureaucratic snuffus and foreseeable chaos unfolding on 100 different fronts at once in 1,000 voting precincts, all of which will leave the U.S. with its most uncertain, disputed result in a lifetime. Excuse me. People often deploy the perfect storm metaphor incorrectly, using it to describe a surprise collision of events that catches its victims off guard. But that's not how perfect storms really work. In Sebastian Junger's book about a deadly Atlantic Ocean gale that popularized the term, the storm was a well-foreseen event with very serious warnings that people saw coming and chose instead to ignore until it was too late and the waves overwhelmed them. That's how this election is starting to look to experts. What's likely to go wrong, and is there any way to head it off? Conversations with election specialists and security officials, plus analysts of recent government reports, make clear that there are 8 distinct but connected challenges. At the technical end are the uncertain new voting technologies and processes put in place for the pandemic. On the geopolitical end, we face foreign adversaries energized by their success sowing confusion in 2016. And at the center is the unprecedented human factor, the dislocations and risks associated with voting in an uncontrolled viral outbreak. My biggest concern for the fall election is an election administrator's job is to convince the losers that they lost. Add to that a year that has already seen unprecedented street protests and vivid displays of political violence, and an incumbent president who has already been impeached for attempting dirty tricks in this election and who is uniquely likely to cast doubt on the results if he loses, and you have a combustible recipe. A handful of public officials have been trying to sound the alarm, such as Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, who has made an issue of election security and recently warned that the country could be headed toward an electoral Chernobyl. Wow. Okay, Chernobyl in the Ukrainian language is wormwood. Chernobyl means wormwood. So putting that into this mix right here is quite apocalyptic. Many of the election experts interviewed for this story asked to speak unanimously to voice candid fears that they didn't want to be associated with their employers. Some have been more forthcoming about how hard it will be for the nation to agree on what happens next. My biggest concern for the fall election as an election administrator's job is to convince the losers that they lost. Washington's Republican Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, told me this spring during an event at the Aspen Institute where I had its cybersecurity initiatives. I guarantee you that half of the country cannot conceive that Republicans can win in November. The other half of the country cannot conceive that Democrats can win. All of the following are utterly foreseeable. And keep in mind, none of these weigh the X factor of a truly unexpected event who, after all, had the 2016 election hinging on Anthony Weiner's laptop. Okay. Well, anyway, this article really brings out a number of points that I just wanted to share with you. I mean, number one, 2020 has already been a disaster in every sense of the word. Basically, they're putting it on the shelf as far as even reopening the schools for this fall. They're calling for another year of lockdowns with the pandemic and the protests, the political upheaval that has been taking place, and now the fact that an electronic ballot, some type of electronic election is not going to be accepted on either side. Okay, so this is it's brewing to become the perfect storm, and 8 reasons why Election Day 2020 could be a disaster. The perfect storm. Is there a connection between the Hebrew calendar, the beginning of Noah's flood, on the day of the United States election on November 3rd? A lot to think about. People, more than anything, get back to the Word of God, get back to the Bible, get back to Jesus Christ. He is coming soon, and the perfect storm that is brewing, all the signs are here that things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and people, instead of preparing and planning accordingly, are pretty much ignoring the situation, the reality of what is really happening in the world today. Are you ready for the return of Jesus Christ? I pray you're blessed. This is Steve Fletcher with a trumpet for my people, the sign of his coming revealed.